Hello. How are you doing? You're welcome to the Michael Harding podcast. There's a few background sounds. In the distance you can hear a clock. That's in the hallway. It's a cheap clock at the moment, but it's sitting there hanging on the wall because it's marking the spot, I'd love to get a really nice clock for the corridor, the hallway. And you come into a house and there's a clock ticking. There's a man, a friend of mine, he says it's a lonesome house that you don't hear a clock ticking in. And when you get used to the sound of a clock, that becomes the truth, because it's like the mechanism within the house, it's like the heartbeat of the house, the clock ticking. And a house without the clock ticking then seems lonesome. You'll also hear there sometimes a vehicle passing on the roadway, because where I am recording this is close enough to the main, well, not the main road, but the local road. And I'm talking about Buddhism. I love talking about Buddhism. And then I love talking about Christianity as well. And you'd say, well, why are you talking about those things? Because they're so unfashionable in the world we're living in, I think. But actually, I feel we're never going to find happiness until you resolve that whole area of your spirituality. And I feel that there is a transition has happened where religions, which were once kind of contained in the vessels of institutions, it's like the vessel broke, the jug smashed, and what was inside was nectar. And that's flowing out now all over the place. So that's what's really an exciting aspect of the church declining in the West, is that it has allowed more people to be empowered with faith. We're journeying somewhere. We're in a time of fluidity, a time of transition. And the kind of vessel that carries religious faith or spirituality now is actually your own body and mind. The singularity of yourself and how you express yourself as a metaphor. How you embody poetry by being the poem. And that happens when you realize that you are not contained in all the rational ways that you can explain yourself. You're not contained in any of the labels. You're not Irish or American. You're not Jewish or Hindu. You're not Christian or non-Christian. There's an infinity within the self. And when you step over the threshold into faith is when you recognize that the infinity within the self is infinity, is immeasurable, and it is what you might call God if you want. You can call it by other names. But there is this sense of deep, limitless source of being, and we come in touch with it when we are alone, when we are still, when we are mindful, when we meditate, when we pray, and when we're in a house alone with only the clock ticking. The lovely thing about the clock is that it measures out time. And time and space are the two things that go together with matter. So you've got three dimensions of matter that cannot exist outside time and space. And you've got time that cannot exist without space, and space that cannot exist without matter and time. These three things go together, are codependent, and form the cosmos that we are living in. But every one of us knows there is this really deep infinity inside us. As if the very core of ourself was the point at which something was penetrating the universe from outside. And we don't know what that is. But our intuition, and the intuition of every religious tradition in history, has been that whatever that great infinity is, it's good, it's benevolent, it's like it's holding everything together. And when we come up against things which are evil, they seem like the opposite of what that stuff is inside. It's why we keep using the image of darkness and light, because we know physically what darkness is and we know what light is, but it's also real and true that light penetrates darkness, scatters darkness. And sometimes there are moods we get into and feelings we have. They're like a big bundle of confused stuff, and we have to go to a psychotherapist and we have to sort it out and untangle the wires and become clearer about our memories and forgive the past and let go of people we're clinging to and understand how our unconscious is throwing out shadows, and that we're engaging with other people as unconscious dynamic. All that stuff that needs to be done, all that mess of being human. We know all that, but we also know that there's a clarity comes sometimes. And that clarity is like light coming through darkness. So at the psychological level, we experience light, clarifying the darkness and the confusedness and the unconscious bits. And at the physical level, we experience the same if we're ill. Some little illness comes to me, and all of a sudden, because I'm not used to it, I feel dark. I feel like, oh, I'm depressed. And when this happened for the first time in a very strong way was how many years ago now, nearly 10 years ago in 2011. And so I was sick, so I was in hospital. So they said, you might have a bit of a serious problem here going into the future. And I really couldn't handle it. And it started to bring up all sorts of other times that I was unhappy in life and that I'd forgotten about as a child. And I ended up depressed. I ended up in a room on my own. Even though the beloved would come in and out and in and out, loved me, fed me, minded me, and yet you're there in the bed. You could be in a room with other people, and yet you're alone. You feel alone in depression. Like somebody said, it's like a bell jar, like a glass bell jar goes right down on top of you, and so you're inside in this bell jar, and there's glass between you and the rest of the world. And I began to feel that, certainly, at that time. And I was shocked at the idea that aging was real and that vulnerability to illnesses was a real fact that probably would become more a part of my life as I got older. And that seemed to say, oh, I'm getting no sweets. This is awful. And I became depressed, was depressed for maybe, I would think, about a year and a half. And then gradually I began to man up. It's an awful phrase, isn't it? It's wrong at every level, that phrase, but anyway. We get these phrases, I think, from American culture and from sometimes the violent side of American culture. Man up. Another one is lockdown. You know, the lockdown. Lockdown is a word I only ever heard during wartime, when a military army would totally disable the civilian population. I heard it when I'd be listening to news reports about Iraq, when the Americans and the British were on their adventures there. And they'd say some particular city was in lockdown, or some province was in lockdown. Meant like nobody could move. The guys with the guns and the uniforms and the big planes were everywhere. Lockdown. And then they started using it in the pandemic, and I thought, you know, it's a very American word, and it's a very violent word. You know, there's that wonderful movement of people who talk about, you know, non-violent language. You can actually get books on non-violent language. Sometimes when we're talking to our children or our parents, we unconsciously use violent language. We use words and phrases that are offensive, that are too strong. Where are you going with that jacket on you? It's kind of a bit violent. I'm going out to see me friends. You are not. You're going to go in there and do your homework. It's very violent language. It's authoritative, but it goes over the top into aggression. And you can think of other examples yourself. I mean, there's millions of them. I'm just talking off the top of my head. I can't remember any further ones, but we use violent language all the time, and there's a whole tradition about non-violent language. And it strikes me that they might have found a better word for lockdown. Even quarantine seems more acceptable. But it's like we live in this violent world. There's no end to it on television, on the movies, on Netflix or whatever. There's no end to. And I think that once it gets into the system, then everybody competes with it, so that like nobody's listening to you if you're not using some sort of what people might call muscular language, but I call it violent language. And I talk about it because I use it myself, you know. It's like I experience myself using this, and it's a lovely example of how I can't divide the world into me being the good guy and everybody else being the bad guys. I'm the bad guy. It's not that I'm the light, it's I'm the darkness. And again, it's where I think there's this great, wonderful thing happening in the world. There's a transformation going on. There's a kind of awakening. There's a bigger consciousness coming to people. And the reason is, it's like the sense of darkness is something that probably through psychiatry and psychotherapy, people in the West have come to realize is part of the dynamic that is inside us. It's like original sin, really, in Christian tradition. And I suppose the breaking of the vessel, if I could use that image of how institutions are breaking up, religious institutions are completely being shattered. But it's like breaking a vessel in which there was nectar, and the nectar it pours out everywhere. So I think it's really a time of empowerment, a time of finding whatever language suits you to talk about the infinity that is inside you. You know it. It's only a question of finding the right language and the right name for it that suits you. And your language might be a modern, newly invented way of speaking about all that infinity inside you. Or you might be more comfortable returning to something more conventional, like the language of the Christian tradition, or you might go towards Buddhism or whatever. Whatever suits you is a good way to start. And I don't mean it that you're picking and choosing. I don't mean it that you're going to make a soup out of your spirituality, which is not a great idea. But when you initially pick something and try something, you can think about it as like being open. What you're doing is you're being open to see, will the universe invite you in this direction? Will it work for you? And then if it does, you'll find that your language begins to use phrases like, that you discovered this way or this path, but that this path was for you. That in some shape and form of the universe, this is the way that you were chosen to walk. I do love that idea of being chosen. Not that you're chosen to be the great one at the top table with a big, crown on your head. But that no matter what you're doing, in the quietest little corner of the world, the quietest little corner of the house, you are chosen. I love that feeling even when I'm doing these podcasts. I mean, I'm again sitting here on my own on a Friday afternoon in a room, and you could stand outside and say, what is he doing? What is that about? And I'd have to answer, I don't know. But I actually feel called that in some way this is the right place for me to be now, in this moment. And because that triangle of time, space and matter is so numinous, like those are the three things that you need, the three corners of the triangle that make up some kind of reality that we call the cosmos. Time, space and matter. And so they were the foundations or the building blocks or the pillars. Everybody thought they're really substantial. They're definitely the basics. Something about time was absolute, something about matter was absolute, something about space was obviously absolute, like space is space. And now science has moved so much further that scientists and biologists and physicists question that, have we got a handle on those three corners of the triangle at all? Time is a most mysterious thing, and so is space, and so is, most of all, so is matter. So there's a great sense for me of living in a dream, living in a dream world. It's like when I walk about on the outside, I'm in a dream because I don't. There's something terribly mysterious, terribly fluid about being in the present moment. And when I go on the inside, when I begin to become mindful for a few moments, it's where I feel reality is happening. And when I feel the two are connected, when I feel that, it's one single lens. So on the inside, I was walking on the beach this morning, actually. I'll tell you this. I was walking on the beach near Carrickfinn in Donegal, and the October light was coming through the clouds. The clouds had broken, so there was good settled weather. There was gaps here and there in the grey cloud, and the sun was coming through, and it was coming at an angle, very, very sharp angle. Above Errigal, it was coming from that direction and coming onto the beach at that slant, so that it picked up, the sand dunes sideways and made a glorious light in the sand of the dunes, and a real sharp edge on the whiteness of the waves. And the waves were very small and they were very quiet. And the tide was out, and there was a huge, huge apron of sand, and it was being lit sideways by direct sunlight, and then there was this roof of grey, purple cloud, because it was just getting broken in every so often. It was a very, very tender day, very mild day, morning. And to walk there, you could only feel blessed, only feel grateful. But how long does it last? Time. Or what is it that I'm walking in? Space. Or what is this stuff? The ocean. Do you see what I mean? Your mind just goes into the heart, and you become overwhelmed by the sense of relationship with the world around you. That's what happens to me all the time. And if there's darkness, I begin to recognize it in myself. So I begin to see that there's a struggle all the time within oneself. And I begin to find that the pathway to overcome whatever darkness it is, whether it's a struggle with illness, or whether it's a kind of an emotional thing where I find myself possessed by negative energies. Whatever the struggle is, it's darkness within myself, and the struggle to have light, to penetrate it, to dissipate it. And that comes, as far as I'm concerned, from faith, from religious practice. I was watching the Dalai Lama this morning, and I have one of those links into his official site, the Office of His Holiness the Dalai Lama, and if you link into it, then they give you notifications whenever he's live. He's doing something live. And he was talking to on Zoom. He had about 50 young people. I don't know what it was about because it wasn't in English. And he was talking in English, but one or two others were talking in English, but the voiceover, the person who was dubbing it, was talking, I presume, in Tibetan. So you couldn't hear what they were saying, and you couldn't understand the Tibetan. But I did hear him say one thing in English before the translator began to work, and that was, he was talking about how he sleeps well at night. He sleeps for 9 hours every night, 9 hours. And he says, then he gets up and he does, some meditation. And he said, then he says, he is able to teach. He's able to live the life of the day. And it brought me to my own sense. I do sleep reasonably well, although there's times when I'm not sleeping well. I wake in the middle of the night, and I don't, I don't meditate, I don't do any of this stuff. I talk about it because I'm a storyteller, but do I do it? Not at all. I sense it's what I should be doing, and maybe in a little way I do, maybe in a little, very small way, but that would only, it'd only be sort of saying to you, the tiniest little bit you do could change your life. The tiniest little bit of mindfulness or meditation or prayer. The one, lighting one candle as one gesture once a week. That's enough. Or randomly. It's amazing what would change your life. And the way that I think it could change your life, the way that I think the religion could change your life, is that living on the inside in your mindful soul, you develop, let's say, a mentor deity who is, let us say, Jesus. And the more you focus on that kind of dynamic, now you're not imagining some sort of visual image of Jesus, but it brings you into the present moment. It's like all the time in the Christian tradition, it's like surfacing in the present moment and feeling that moment and that matter, that physicality, that space and that time, that everything, the three dimensions are actually imbued with Christ. They are actually not different from Christ or representing Christ. They are. This is the Christ. We are all, if you like, in this cosmic Christ. And what is Christ? Human nature transformed and defying death on the basis of the infinite love that is within the human, the infinite consciousness, awakening love, compassionate love, forgiving love, with no limit. With no limit, so that infinity within that I'm talking about is like an infinity of goodness, an infinity of love and compassion and generosity and love in particular. And that is kind of lifted up through death, through all the sufferings, the unbearable, unimaginable sufferings of all humanity, lifted up into some perfect consciousness, perfect being, like the Pantocrator Christ that you see on the dome of an Orthodox church when you look straight up towards heaven, and there he is. It's I get lost for words sometimes speaking of the Christian tradition. But there you have it. What I'm saying is that when you develop a religious practice, you're developing it so that it's like a lens that brings you more intensely into the present moment. And it's very possible that many, many people use exactly the same thing without necessarily being religious. So there's no naming of this in a sense of, because I'm a religious person, then I think it's a right to be religious. In fact, it could be the opposite. There's just no measuring what happens in the world. There's no measuring how you will be invited to awaken, or in what language, or in what tradition, or what will be the trigger in your life. For me, 10 years ago was a trigger. When I was sick. When I was sick and I didn't want to fall into the complete darkness of despair. When I was depressed, I found that I was clutching religious practice. And yes, I used it as a lifeboat. And yes, it worked. Why wouldn't I use it as a lifeboat if it works? You don't have to think about some sort of heavenly realm in the future in order to justify or defend the idea that you are religious. All you need to do is to be aware of the fact that if you're able to live lighter, great word, isn't it? It means light in the sense of light, but light in the sense of not being too depressed, but lighter. If you're able to live lighter, if you're able to live joyfully in the present moment, and if you're able to really, really grasp the source of life, everything's precious in life, then that's enough to validate religious practice. And sometimes it can be a danger to get too serious about religion, which is kind of really interesting, isn't it? Sometimes it's when you start to take it as truth, when you clench the fist and say, I have discovered the truth. That's the point at which you're missing the truth. And that's true in all religions. The minute you start to actually become convinced that this is the truth, the absolute truth, a truth that you could impose on other people because it would be good for them, you can see where that goes. You can see how that has created so much devastation in history, where, you know, the law of Christ was used with the sword of Caesar to enforce it. The sword of Caesar is used in all religions at all times, and including now. There's no need to mention them in particular, but there's no need to go there. Don't go there. Stay on the peripheral. Stay on the edge with the people that Jesus was with. With Job. And with the Buddha. And that's where this talk fits into the story of the Buddha. Because in the mystery of just walking around on the beach, in the mystery of experiencing a sense of being alive, a sense of being awake, that is indescribable to other people, and yet all of us know it, where we experience the infinity within. That's a moment that needs our attention. What also needs our attention is the sense that evil is not on the outside in the other people, it is within. And there is something about the dynamic going on inside that is like a battle, that you want to do good, but you get drawn into evil. And evil can have different levels: moral evil, physical evil. It can be depression, it can be sickness, it can be anything that is bad and crushes you and is negative to your free soul. And yet I know that this is the world we live in, this is the cosmos we live in, and none of us is without physical suffering, emotional suffering, and our own violent language and violent energies that want to do destructive things. So this battle is going on. This is who we are. And while you can take much of it to a psychotherapist, there is also, it seems to me, for me personally, a wonderful pathway by going to the room in the heart inside, and then you become much more awake to what's on the outside, and also using rituals and using the idea that you are your own metaphor. So this has been really singing the value of not religion, but the value of examining your life at that level. And religion then is merely a tool that is very, very useful. The idea of grasping the source of your life is really one of the next big ideas to think about, and I'll do it in the next podcast. I'll read you a little bit in the Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. The great Tsongkhapa, he says this: "This opportune physical form is worth more than a wish-granting gem. You only gain its like the once. So hard to get, so easily destroyed. It's like a lightning bolt in the sky. Contemplate this, and you will realize all worldly actions are but winnowed chaff. And night and day you must extract some essence from your life. I, the yogi, practiced this way. You, wanting liberation, do the same." So we're moving now towards what they call the preliminaries in the Lamrim teaching. The preliminaries, these ideas to reflect on before you actually get into the full discussion. And the big preliminary is to grasp the essence of life. Grasp the essence. Don't just live at the emotional level. Don't just live at the rational level. Don't just live at the physical level. Whether you use Christian or any other tradition, use it to grasp the essence of life. And don't be put off by the negativity that comes from institutional religions that makes you feel that you are not wanted in it, or you don't belong in it, or it did too much damage to people through history for you to have anything to do with it, or because that you're more intelligent than anybody that ever lived. Don't just go there. Give it a chance. Use it when you need it, when you're sick or ill or depressed or lonely. Find the comfort in it. Find the joy in it. And gradually you'll come to this point where you'll realize that grasping the essence of life is a process that happens when you use religious practice. That's exactly what religious practice helps us to do. It helps us to grasp the essence of life. And that's a Buddhist idea, but turn over the pages of the Gospels and you'll hear Jesus saying, "I came to bring you life, that you might have life and that you might have it in its fullness, that you might have it more fully, that you might have life." There's an awful lot of value, by the way, in reading through the Gospels with the lens of psychotherapy and modern psychology, and realizing that Jesus, when you're reading words like "that you may have life," there's a poetry to this. It's not kind of necessarily about something happening away down the future, when you're dead and go to heaven or something. It's about now. Jesus is always talking about the kingdom of heaven being now, really now. I wouldn't be able to distinguish Jesus from many, many Buddhist wisdom teachers. Same thing. It's now. The wisdom flows out like nectar, universally. We hear the infinity within calling us. And so that's the great first preliminary on the Lam Rim path. The Lam Rim path, a journey towards understanding Buddhism. And I know it's a long session. There's no way to do these. There's no way to do these Lam Rim teachings when I'm reflecting on them. I'm going through the pages of a book called Liberation in the Palm of Your Hand. It's a huge book. There's no way you could be doing it in short bursts. So if you have stayed with me for this one, I thank you so much. Thank you for being here. And the next one will be about grasping the essence of life. There's a number of reasons, just to talk about it very quickly as a kind of a foreshadow what I'll do in the next session, but it's like the shortness of life is the first point to look at. You know, wake up, life is short. So don't be letting it flow through your hands. Get to the essence of what it is to be here. And secondly, look at this thing about good and evil. You know, that your actions are sometimes good actions and sometimes they're not good actions. But all actions have consequences. Everything has a consequence. Everything has a cause and effect. And that will invite you to really reflect on your actions, if they have consequences. And then think about how the shortness of life is attended with the unpredictability about when you die. You know, it's absolutely certain that you'll die, I think. So it's certain that you die, but nobody can tell when it's going to happen. I think I'm pretty good at the moment. My health is pretty good, but I had a few moments in the past 10 years where I began to feel, wow, I'm vulnerable. You never know when. Think about the fact that everybody that's living now in the whole world, every single human that is alive today, and in, let's say, 150 years' time, none of them, none of us will be here. We'll all be gone. Silent. So death is a kind of a reality. There are some people, they fall out of their standing and they're dead before they hit the ground. And that's an image that Pabanka uses. He says some people, you know, might fall down in front of you and they would be dead before they hit the ground. They might be in mid-sentence. And you think that's like just a kind of a colourful image, but I remember in Mullingar about 15 years ago, less, 12 years ago, a man was standing in the stable yard with his daughter's horse, and the horse grooming, or the daughter grooming the horse, and him standing there holding the reins. And he fell. And he was dead. Comes very quickly to some, very slowly, gradually to others. But the certainty of death, the unpredictability of when it happens, the fact that all our actions have consequences, these are realities that we begin with as the preliminaries to grasp the essence of life. And I come back to them in the next session of The Laughing Buddha. Thank you for being here. Bye-bye.